Again, I'll be presenting on behalf of Jennifer today on this paper on complexity versus simplicity in water energy food assessment tools. So again, accompanied by this growing body of literature that we witnessed in the past few years on exploring and quantifying the interlinkages and interconnections between water energy and food systems was a growth of tools and models that try to explain and quantify those interlinkages in the goal of communicating those interconnections and trade-offs for different interventions for policymakers and decision makers within water, energy, and food systems. With that growing number of tools comes a challenge for users for identifying which tools are most appropriate for them to use for the purpose, for the type of the scale of the case study they work in, the kind of data they need, building on the resources that they have. So how can we better look at this list of tools that are available to us in the literature and better identify a way to help us pick whatever is good for our specific case study. So what this paper specifically tries to identify is some key factors that contribute to a complexity versus simplicity of the tool. So one of the main objectives will be to defining that complexity in context of criteria that contribute to that metric. And the second would be developing that index and developing a quantification to the different tools and their level of complexity based on the developed criteria. And the third objective will be to visualize the complexity, that spectrum of complexity and simplicity of tools within the context of the different purposes and different methodologies that these tools adopt. So to give you a quick overview of the methodology, we looked at the literature at the tools that were published in the past 10 years, covers at least 2 out of 3 of the water, energy, food components, and are available online as of May 2018. So we ended up analyzing and looking at 8 tools that are cited and currently used in the literature, and we looked at 8 criteria to identify the complexity of the different tools. So we looked at data accessibility, user friendliness of their interface, open accessibility, data granularity, the data input requirements for different tools, how much training they require, as well as subject matter expertise needed. And a lot of these criteria were inspired from the system usability scale for assessment models, which is one of the commonly used scales for assessing the usability of different models and the user friendliness of those models. So one thing we did was develop a scoring index for these criteria and looked at different tool purposes and tool methodologies according to the United Nations Development Group, SDG. So what they have done is that they have looked at different categorized tools according to different purposes, looked at diagnostic tools, scenario building tools, capacity building tools, etc., as well as different tool methodologies. So based on the criteria that we developed, we quantified those complexity indices, and again, within the context of also understanding what is the purpose of each of these tools, what is the methodology that they have been using, and the scope they cover, and map those against the different tool purposes and methodologies. And one of the things that doing such a mapping would help is identifying some gaps in some of the categories of tools. As we see here, there are some gaps in last mile tools, guideline, capacity building tools, and help us give an indication of the level of complexity based on the criteria adopted in this study. So what this kind of visual would help new users that are looking to use different tools for their Nexus assessment case studies is understand where do each of these tools fall in terms of complexity, but also in terms of category of purpose and methodology and scope that they cover. So some of the key messages that come out of this paper were that higher complexity is not necessarily does not necessarily mean more superior, and lower complexity does not mean that it's better. There are different uses for different types of tools. There are trade-offs for using those different types of tools, which cover different purposes and have different levels of simplicity and complexity. Simpler tools require lower data needs, are good for rapid assessments, are good for quick policy responses, so we are able to quickly identify certain trends and certain trade-offs with limited resources and limited time, and they could play a major role in identifying hotspots and early initial assessment stages of different resource hotspots. More complex tools do require more time, more resources, and more capacity, but also are more capable of addressing more detailed, more granular questions that also are needed in certain cases. Moving forward, there's a lot of tools that are out there that we could leverage and build on. So increased coordination, collaboration to avoid repetition of methodologies and tool development is one thing that is important to be aware of, so that we don't end up recreating those tools every time anyone wants to work on a Nexus case study. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. I urge all the speakers to stick to 5 minutes, otherwise we're going to be here having a long night. The first Q&A is to really, we divided the Q&A so that people are interested in the modeling, they don't have to stay with their questions, burning questions till the end. So this is the first Q&A, and I'd like to suggest that we take the first set of questions from the live audience here at AUB, and then we'll move to the live audience at Texas A&M Energy Institute, and we'll take a couple, one or two questions depending on the time from the WebEx guests. And I promise, and I'll make this clear, that all of the questions that are posed on the chat will be addressed by the speakers. So this is a promise that we will be, so if you have a question that we didn't have a chance to really respond to you, please log in and pose your questions there, and we promise to log those, and we'll be responding to all of the questions. So any questions from the live audience here at in AUB? Texas?
You want to go ahead? Do we have any questions from AUB?
Let me pose a question to the audience, because I think this is very revealing. If you look at the outcome of this simplicity versus complexity model, this is an ongoing debate. The Nexus is a very, very complex system. And within the Nexus community, there are discussions about, do we really build a monster model to answer a simple binary question from a policymaker? And that is a very relevant question. So depending on who is asking the question, the model to address those questions could be very simple. But if a scientist is asking a question about processes involving these complex systems, then the answer would not be build a simple model to answer a complex question about processes. So I think this is a very revealing that the tool that we develop has to address the question and who is asking the question. If you're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, a policymaker, you may not need a very complex tool that takes long, not only to develop, but a lot of data input that may or may not be available. So those questions are very, very critical with the Nexus community that I hope at some point we will address. Any questions that from the, if no questions from the audience, WebEx, I would move to the second set of